I'm falling away, I can't see straight. I'm losing my mind, losing my mind. I'm falling away, I can't see straight. I'm losing my mind, losing my mind. I'm falling away, I can't see straight. I'm losing my mind, losing my mind. Falling away, I can't see straight. I'm losing my mind, losing my mind. I'm falling away, I can't see straight. I'm losing my mind, losing my mind. I'm falling away, I can't see straight. I'm losing my mind, losing my mind. I'm falling away, I can't see straight. I'm losing my mind, losing my mind.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Brute Facts. We have a pretty cool show tonight. I got a friend of mine. One second. I got feedback. Not sure where it's coming from. Okay, there we go. I got a great show tonight. Got a friend of mine, Caleb Jackson. He's a pretty smart guy. He's a little better looking than me, so don't be throwing me shade. We're going to be talking about miracles, modern day miracles, something I'm really interested in, given them the amount of stories and things that you hear. But anyway, thank you guys for joining us. And I want to mention again, we have a lot of people that are looking for assistance with the Content Creator Fund. So if you feel compelled to give or share, at least share, amongst your friends, social media and things. The links are in the description. We've got Patreon for anybody that wants to give monthly. And we have a GoFundMe for the one-time donation. Much appreciated if you can. If you can't, pray for us and just share away. So with that, we are going to run the intro and bring on the most interesting guy of the night. Hello, Caleb. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and that intro was a lot cooler than I was expecting. So props to you for that.
Well, you know what? I appreciate that. I have another one, which is actually the one I'm meant to run. I hit the wrong one. Yeah, the other one I have a friend of mine. I don't know if you know Pasta Mike.
I think I probably interact.
Yeah, he's like super awesome editing skills and stuff like that. Yeah, so a lot of I was kind of going back to his, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. So yeah, as he said, my name is Caleb Jackson. It's posted on there. I am a kind of just an independent researcher. Recently graduated college from IU. I like to study theology and philosophy, and I've self-published 2 books from a few years ago. One of them is called Undead. This is an old cover. The newer cover is better, but that's on the resurrection, a historical investigation to the most famous miracle in history. And the next one, which is the newer one from 2021, is Searching for a Solution to Suffering. And I always like the alliterations in there, a Christian response to the problem of evil. So both of those are on Amazon, and they both kind of cover different topics, but that kind of sparked my interest into the research that I'm currently doing, which is what we're discussing today, is on modern day miracles. So I started looking into that topic probably in January 2021. So I've been writing this for well over a year now, probably about a year and a half, and I'm planning on finishing it probably about fall of this year, and hopefully having the book out and published, hopefully by a publication company this time, a publisher, sometime next year. So that's my plan as far as this stuff goes. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here and talk about it. I've been on other shows, and I think just getting this out, because I feel like this is one of those kind of open secrets in apologetics and theology that doesn't get all the attention it deserves, especially compared to, say, the Kalam cosmological argument or the fine-tuning argument. Like, they get a lot of, not that those are bad, but they get so much attention. I feel like this is an area that is not very looked at as much, other than the resurrection. Everyone talks about the resurrection, but outside of that, you don't hear that much in the apologetics community about modern miracle claims. And I think they're pretty strong evidence and really compelling. And so that's why we're giving those lip service today.
Rock on. Yeah. I knew you were a published author. I was actually going to introduce you that way, but I don't remember everything. And I will get the links to the books from Amazon into the description for anybody that's interested. Yeah, that's one of the things. We get so kind of nearsighted in the West. We're more educated, and we're more empiricist in a way, and things like that. And we don't even think about the Far East, and there's claims of miracles all over the world all the time. I mean, not that they're true, but here, we tend to just kind of, they're mystical people or spiritual people or things like that. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and I think it's something that we blow over way too much. Did you find out anything interesting while researching this, like any kind of certain claims that were like outlandish or something like that ended up being hoaxes or anything like that? Or
yeah, so I mean, definitely that's true. So I tried to be pretty scrupulous and careful as I can. So most of the claims that I talk about and look at in the book are ones from the West that are medically documented. I do look at a couple from the developing world, and not that we should discount those, but they're just usually the documentation is not as good because the medical technology just isn't there. And so it really just depends on the claim. And so there are plenty of ones. In fact, I would say the majority of them are probably not credible or easily explained by misdiagnosis or something else, or adjusting my camera, or misunderstanding. And sometimes, on very rare occasions, you do get outright fraud. That has happened a few times. But generally, I think that when people look, there are some really compelling ones once you sort through those. And hopefully, I think in this talk we're doing today, we'll have a little bit of discussion on how to distinguish between credible versus non-credible claims, because I don't think anyone, you or I, or most people who do this, would say that we should believe all of these claims without any kind of skepticism. Certainly not. But I think people apply that too far and say that therefore we shouldn't believe any of them. And I think that's going too far as well. So I think there's a middle ground, and I think that's what we need to look at. So the theist doesn't have to say that all miracle claims are legitimate. All you have to do to say God exists is that at least one of them is, or more than one, hopefully. But one is technically the minimum you need for theism to be true by definition, if miracles are things that are attributed to God. So just looking at the probabilities there of the millions of claims that we do have. Yeah,
and I will attest to the fact that he is thorough, because I tried to submit one and he rejected me.
Wow, you sound so harsh when you say it like that.
Yeah, no, it was something that I had ran by him, and it was actually I'm actually kind of glad I did bring it up, because it made me go back and kind of research some things and learn some things that I didn't know. Yeah, I think we kind of have I don't necessarily disagree that skepticism to an extent can be, a virtue. Um, but we tend to be so skeptical, and I love what you said. We only need one to be true. And I was actually working on an argument myself at one time about, naturalism versus the theist, because for naturalism to be true, it has to be a naturalistic answer for everything. For theism to be true, we only need one. And then naturalism is false. And given the probability of all of the events that happen, it just seems probabilistically that theism is true. There, folded like a chair. Y'all, everybody wrap it up. We just proved theism.
Great show, everybody. Thanks.
You ready with the presentation?
I am. So I think when Eddie and I talked before the cameras are on, I'm just going to do this, but it's going to be pretty informal. So we're going to be talking through it. It's not going to be he waits till the end. So you all can, I don't know if you do super chats, but whatever conversations you want to have is while we're going through it, and doesn't have to be to the end, unless they want to do it to the end. So it's just a bit more informal that way.
That stinks, Caleb. I'm not monetized yet. We can't.
It is.
No, I'm just fine.
Yeah.
You're going to share your screen with me so I can.
I am. Yes. Hold on. Oh, hold on. Share screen.
Not the one with the Marvel comics. The one with the.
Funny. Can you see that?
I can.
Great. Perfect.
All
so.
Right.
Yeah, this is a shortened version of a presentation I usually do, and I tend to switch out some of the cases just to make it interesting. So not every show I do is the same. But yeah, we're going to be looking at the argument from miracles. So first of all, how do we formulate this in terms of theism, right? So the argument is, well, first of all, what is a miracle? So a miracle in this definition is something that is the intervention of the laws of nature by a supernatural agent, okay? So we can formulate this deductively and say, Premise 1, a miracle is an event which could only occur through the intervention of God and is impossible in the absence of such interposing. Premise 2, at least one miracle has occurred in history. Premise 3, therefore, at least one event in history required the intervention of God to occur. Premise 4, therefore, God exists. Now, premise 1 is just a definitional semantic one. So I think the only one for contention would be premise 2. And that's definitely the most contentious one as far as, demonstrating that. So in theory, it's like that seems correct. But can we actually say that that's probable that something like that did occur? So do you have any questions about that formulation, or do you think that seems pretty clear cut?
No, that seems pretty clear. It looks valid. I'm pretty sure it's sound too.
Yeah, I'd hope so. You want valid and sound in an argument.
That's
okay.
Right.
So in order to do premise 2, then is what we're looking at, right? So how do we show that, or how do we say probabilistically that a miracle, at least one miracle, has occurred in history? Well, I think you'd have to do 3 things. One is establish that the event itself occurred. So if someone said they walked in water, we wouldn't automatically go to jumping, well, how do we explain that? We would say, well, did the act itself happen? And then we look for explanation. So we have to first say, are they just lying, or do people just make a story up, or was there an event that is based off of? And then we look at the explanation. So then after we establish that the event probably did happen, then we establish we weigh the explanations. Is there any way this could have happened naturally? And look at competing explanations. And then once we roll out all natural explanations, then we have to ask, well, okay, is God then the best explanation? So what is the context for this? What are the causal mechanisms behind it? What are the qualities of this that would make it more likely to be theistic than naturalistic? So that's kind of the thing we go there. So for especially for the first and second ones on there, I want to go back and say that when we look at miracles scientifically, or at least try to study these things, often you'll see studies about people testing prayer, where they'll have a group of people that they'll pray for and a group of people they won't pray for, and both groups are sick, and they'll try to see which one gets better first. There's a famous study by the Templeton Foundation in the early 2000s that infamous because it showed that prayer didn't have an effect, and also the people who were prayed for did slightly worse than the ones who did. And so people tout that as, see, this is evidence that prayer doesn't work. Although there were similar studies back in the 80s that had the exact opposite conclusion, where it showed that people who were prayed for did get better. So the prayer studies of those cases have very mixed results. Sometimes you'll get recovery, sometimes you won't. And it's very hard to measure this in either way. But I think the more efficient way is when we're looking at a miracle and we're asking, what is the hypothesis here? So if the hypothesis is that prayer is more likely to work over not. I don't think that would even be the Christian hypothesis, because or if you were to say that your hypothesis is that God answers all prayers, well, that's very easy falsifiable. I don't think most people would argue that. That's easy to disprove, because there are people all the time who pray who don't have it happen and they suffer. So that's not a good theory. So if the theory is just that God healed this particular person, or that God is the best explanation for this particular event, then we can do that differently. But the issue is that it's hard to set up preemptive controls, because I don't think we can predict who God would heal. And that's because God is a free agent. So, of course, God is good and God wants to do good things. But if you think that God has reasons for allowing evil, then that means that God's going to have to not intervene most of the time. Otherwise, you wouldn't have evil for, soul building or whatever, or free will, or whatever purpose God wants. So you'd expect, under this model, you'd expect these to be very rare and to not be that common. So we couldn't always expect God is going to heal this person over this person. So I don't think you can do it like that. But I think we can retroactively look at it. So I think if someone says, oh, I think I've been healed by God, we can then look back and ask, okay, well, what was the diagnosis? Can we prove, first of all, that the person was sick and that they're healed? So although we can't actually repeat the healing itself, in my opinion, what you can do is you can at least repeat the two factors prior and posterior to it. So we can demonstrate that the person is healed. All you have to do is take them to a doctor right now, do any scans you want, any tests you want. I can prove that they are currently not sick with whatever condition they have. And we can prove that they were originally sick looking at their past records. And of course, if someone is severely ill, then most of the time they go to the doctor more than once, if they've had multiple operations. So we can look back and say that, the idea that they were sick has many witnesses. We have very well documentation of it. This was repeated because they saw a doctor multiple times. So we can repeat the idea that they were sick and that they are no longer sick. So both of those are repeatable. We just can't repeat the actual healing itself. But I think that's all you need to establish is the two things in the middle, and then establish, well, why are they no longer sick? And this is for healing miracles. So of course you have much more rare things of, people floating or turning water into wine, but those would be different criteria. So that's, I think, how we look at this retroactively. Now, when it comes to criteria for that, I have a slide on this too. So, okay, so it's not just enough to say that a healing is inexplicable. Yeah, that's part of it. It needs to be, oh, we can't explain it, but it's not just that. So we need to take everything we know about natural healing and do the opposite of that. If God wants to stand out from natural law, then we would expect it to look very different than how nature operates. So you want this to be something that's severe and that's unlikely to remit naturally. So if it's something that goes away naturally within a short period of time, it's not that bad. Well, we can't prove that God didn't heal them, but it's not, the theistic hypothesis is no better than the naturalistic one under that model. The healing is, this is probably the most important one. The healing is instantaneous and not gradual. And this is important because by definition, your immune system and your biological systems are made up of different parts. That's why they're systems, different organs, different cells. These work at a rate and these work together. And so your cells produce at a certain rate and your tissues build at a certain rate. And so this is why healing of very severe conditions is very gradual. So someone who's a paraplegic, when they get better, they usually go to physical therapy. They get practice. They have to build up muscle over time. People in comas usually take weeks or months to get out of it, and they have to stay in the hospital for a while until they recover, and so on. And so usually we get very gradual recovery. Same, breaking a bone, you put it in a cast, over a few months it heals. But with theism, God is not limited by time and those resources, so God can heal you like that. And so if you have cases, and we do have some, of people who have, like, for example, a broken bone that instantly mends together within a few minutes of prayer, that's not at all compatible with any of the natural systems we know as far as how that works. You'd have to completely rewrite the human biological systems in order to explain how that could happen that quickly with the rate of cell growth and all that stuff, and without causing other problems. And so the speed is very important. So we're looking for prayer. We're not just looking for people who were sick and then people were praying for them routinely and they eventually got better. We're looking for they got better either at the moment of prayer or directly after, like overnight or very, very soon after prayer, where there can be a direct correlation between the two that is not comparable naturally.
If you don't mind, I just
go ahead.
Sorry. What would be the significance of it having to be immediate? Would it seem to be like more of a natural occurring thing the longer that something kind of pans out or takes?
Yeah. Yeah, because that's how the human body works. So, when you break a bone, you have to put in a cast. Your cells go together and build tissue and build bone over time.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Okay,
So
I see what you're
it's
saying.
like it's like when if you saw a construction site building a skyscraper, it's going to, you see that it slowly get bigger and bigger over the months that
Right.
they're building it. But if you saw a skyscraper happen overnight, that would be surprising. Like that's not, we don't have the technology or the manpower to do that overnight, unless it was like they built it somewhere else and then moved it, right? So that's why it would be so unusual to have this happen, because we know that the body works like a mini construction crew where they're repairing and doing all these repairs to your body. But if it happens like that, it's not a very good hypothesis to say this was a bodily system that did this, because that just goes against everything we know about bodily systems. So that's why immediacy is such an important criteria, I think. And so that's kind of what separates it. The other one is like the healing's complete, not merely partial. So if someone feels a little bit better, but they're still mostly sick, most of the healings in the Bible, people are healed like completely. Now they'll die again. They're not immortal, right? And sometimes they'll have scars or something like that, but they're like functional. So if someone, if someone got a little bit better, but they still have to use like a wheelchair or something, but they just don't, like, it's like, well, is that really a miracle? It would hurt the probability a little bit. Permanent, not temporary. That seems to be a better one too. If they get better, but then get sick again and it kind of fluctuates, well, that makes sense with a natural cause. It's harder to explain that with God, at least it doesn't seem as likely. It's organic and not psychosomatic. So this is something that's physical, not just in your head. So not just placebo. So it is true people can feel better and their symptoms can go away, but we have to ask, are they really healed? So someone can feel like their arthritis goes away and they can put their hands over their head, at faith healing conferences. But if you do the test, well, they still have the disease in their bone. They might just not think they're in pain, but they're still doing damage to the body by moving it around when they're not supposed to. So you want to make sure that it's organic and not psychosomatic. Can't be attributed to treatment or medicine. So that one's kind of obvious. If medicine's like, if it got gradually better with medicine, that's probably a better explanation. It occurs within a religious context. That one's important too. And it's harder to do that because a lot of time, they've shown polls that most people pray for serious illnesses. So it's hard to find a case that didn't have like prayer associated with it, right? It's hard to disprove that someone they knew wasn't praying for them. But most of the cases I'm concerned with are ones where we know prayer happened immediately prior to the healing. And sometimes on rare occasions, this actually happens when you have cases where this happens and the person didn't know about it. So, for example, there was a case of a man who had traumatic brain trauma in Sweden. And one day his friend invites him to church and says, hey, and he had this for like well over a year. He had to wear sunglasses and earplugs because he couldn't stand to be around light and sound because it would give him severe migraines. And his doctor said he would be permanently disabled. So one day his friend says, you want to go to our church? And he's like, well, no, I'm going to go help coach this football game, soccer, but it's Sweden, so it's football. Because that's what he had done. That's how he got injured and got the brain damage. So he would watch from the sidelines in his disabled state. And his friend said, okay, well, you can go do that, but we'll be praying for you. So he goes there, and around 3:00, he instantly feels better, takes it all stuff. And he's like, wow, this is the first time in over a year that I just completely feel better. And he goes, and the brain scans show his brain's completely healed. When he goes back to his friend, he finds out that at the same time that he had recovered, which is about 3 in the afternoon, is when they were having the service and praying for him. So that's one of those kind of cool connections. That's a bit
that's
like,
that's crazy.
Yeah, I know. And the last one is comparable recoveries of the disease are not observed in secular context. Again, it's hard to establish a secular context, but usually when we look at a healing, we then look at the medical literature and say, okay, what do we know about this disease? Is there anything similar to this in the literature? And so if there's other cases of people recovering in a similar way, without any like obvious religious context, that could be more natural. But if this only happens in religious context, that's more substantial. So that's kind of the list of things we're looking for. So do you think that's a pretty fair list? Like to me, it doesn't seem like it's like completely subjective, like it has to be within Christianity or something. I think there's a pretty fair objective criteria of measuring it, I would think. Do you think, is there anything else you would add or that you don't think?
No, I think you covered it pretty good.
Great. Okay. Now when it comes, I'll try to go a little bit faster. So God is the best explanation. Basically, this just looks at comparing the supernatural hypothesis to the natural hypothesis for any given condition and looking for the thing. So I won't read off of all of this because I kind of went over it in the previous slide. But if any of your viewers want to pause it or screenshot it or whatever. So these are just the ways that we weigh them against each other and what we would expect from a miraculous healing versus what we would expect from a natural healing. And so to get to the theistic, to God is best explanation, you just compare the two and say, okay, in this case, which explanation is better? And so you'd have to look at it. So that's all I had to say about that one. Now, when we get to objections about miracles, the most common one you'll hear is David Hume, famous 18th century philosopher, right? He wrote a very well-known essay called Of Miracles, which was in his, I think, Inquiries of Human Understanding, back in the early to mid 1700s. And Hume's argument has been debated as far as how people interpret it, and it's hard to do it. But this is the best syllogism that I can come up with as far as how I understand Hume's argument. So Hume basically says, well, look, premise one, regularities of natural law are firmly established and well evidenced. Every second of every day you spend looking and seeing that gravity exists, that the laws of physics exist, that all these things happen. It's the best evidence we can do. It's repeatable. Everyone agrees on it. This is the best evidence we have. And miracles are contradictions of this. Miracles say, well, no, this doesn't happen. Miracles are violations of that. So that's one problem Hume says. And second one is, and what's the evidence we have for miracles? Well, it's testimony. And the testimony of miracle claims is always problematic, flawed, or deceptive. And he gives reasons for this because people are willing to believe and they're gullible. And of course, religious people are willing to lie and scam people to get money or to build a religion because, you know, if I told you Jesus walked on water, it's not just like, oh, that's a cool story, bro. It's oh, he's God and you should worship him and you should tithe and give me money and all that stuff. So Hume thought that even with other extraordinary claims that one could maybe believe those on testimony, but for religion specifically, we should always be cynical because people always have motive to lie. They're either going to lie or they're going to be gullible and completely misunderstand something, and then they're going to gossip. The story will spread. And so he's just saying you can't ever rely on testimony of religious claims because it's always unreliable. And so his conclusion is, therefore, if we're going to compare these things, we're going to compare the laws of physics that everyone sees that's super well established to miracles, which are not only competing with the laws of physics, but are also just objectively worse based on testimony. Laws of physics are always going to win out. So you'll never be able to have a miracle claim that oversees this. And so Hume says this is an everlasting check, that this isn't just, we haven't had one yet, but it could happen. Some people will interpret Hume to say this therefore shows that we could never establish this. And so that's the short version of Hume's argument. But before I go into the rebuttals to that, do you see any like issues with that from looking at that?
Oh, I see all kinds, but I don't want to say anything that you're probably going to cover in the next the rebuttals because I have one particular.
Well, you can say it. That's okay. I mean, I just had to have a dialogue here. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fact that he assumes that it's a violation of the laws of physics. Which leads me into the second one now, which is, I mean, this is the same man who had the problem of induction, inductive reasoning. He's going based off of experience, and the laws of physics are descriptive. They describe how the world works in certain ways at certain times under certain conditions. We don't know that it always does it. We can have a high confidence in it, but that's what his problem of induction is. But to say it violates those laws is to say it violates this descriptive idea of how we think the world works. Just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no, I think those are good points, and that's kind of, you're right, that I got into. So this is just a book, a book by John Ehrman called Hume's Abject Failure, which is probably the most well-known critique of Hume. I think it was published in 2000. And it's funny because Ehrman is actually an agnostic. He's not even a theist or a Christian, but he's saying even as agnostic philosopher of science, this is a really bad argument and people should stop using it. And he doesn't even believe in miracles, but he's saying that even if you don't believe in miracles, Hume's argument is not a good reason to not believe in miracles because it's
that's a good book too.
Yeah, it is. And so he just shows all the problems. So just to give the short version, a lot of what Eddie said, I absolutely agree with. So the first one is that natural laws are conditional, first of all. And he's right that they're also, I agree that they are descriptive and not prescriptive. And so it's not as if it's like, it's impossible that this could happen. It's just that we've never happened to observe it. But if we did observe it, then it wouldn't be a natural law anymore. So there's a funny Lutheran satire video with of the Lutherans, and Richard Dawkins is like a cartoon, and Dawkins is like, no one can rise from the dead. And they said, well, how do you know that? Because no one ever has risen from the dead. It's like, well, what about the people who said they saw Jesus rise from the dead? Well, no, they can't happen because no one rises from the dead because no one's ever seen it happen. Yeah, unless you count people who saw Jesus rise from the dead. And so it's a circle of, well, no one has ever seen this happen. So any testimony we have can't be accepted because we know it can't happen because no one's ever seen it happen. And anyone who says they've seen it happen must be mistaken because it can't happen. So it's, some people say
Yeah,
that's
it's a vicious epistemic circle.
yes. Anyone who says it happens is clearly lying because we know it doesn't happen because no one's ever seen it.
That's right.
I mean,
Yeah.
So yeah. And the second one is, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, well, that's the issue when I speak with naturalists. You know, methodological naturalism, as far as investigating things, is fine, but when you go into philosophical naturalism, what happens is you assume that naturalism is all that exists. And if the supernatural existed, we would know it through methodological naturalism. And since we don't know, and if we could know it through methodological naturalism, then it would be natural.
Right.
Because naturalism is all that exists. And I'm like, you got to back off of that, you know, just.
And so is naturalism even falsifiable? If you can always say, well, we just don't know, then how would you ever falsify?
Yeah, I would say philosophical naturalism, yeah, it's most definitely not falsifiable.
Right. Yeah. So I think you make good points, and that's kind of what I was trying to say. Another one is that even if you were to take a prescriptive view, even that would have to only apply to closed systems. So you can never say, for example, if I said, is it a miracle if someone walked on water? And you said yes. And I said, well, what if the water was frozen? Okay, now it's not a miracle. Or is it a miracle if a virgin gives birth? Yes. Okay, well, what if she's artificially inseminated? Well, okay, now it wouldn't be. So all laws of nature are conditional of given this, then that, right? So yeah, like it is true that given the laws of physics, a man can't rise from the dead. But if there was God intervening, well, okay, now your conditions are different. So Hume's argument only works if you're arguing that miracles happen under the exact same prior conditions that any other natural law does. But of course, theists don't argue that. They say God is the prior conditions are different because God's intervening in this case where he doesn't in other cases, right? So C.S. Lewis gives the example of saying if you lock up your money in a safe, you know by the laws of physics that money's not going to vanish. It's not going to fall through. Like it can't. The solid can't go through itself. It has to stay in there. But if you come home and the money's gone, you would say, well, shoot, someone broke into the safe. So you wouldn't say the laws of physics are violated. You would just say someone came in and broke into your safe. So you'd hypothesize an external agent in that case interfering with it. So that would be how you would view it.
Yeah, I love what you were talking about with the resurrection. I love Craig's response. You know, if somebody says that Jesus did not rise from the dead, if we're talking about naturally, I agree 100% with you.
Right.
We're not talking about naturally because naturally they don't. But once you add in, you know, the background knowledge of God existing and you know, the idea or the knowledge or the evidence that if God would raise Jesus from the dead or have a good reason or sufficient reason for raising Jesus from the dead, well, that changes everything.
Right, exactly. I think that's a good point, and that's it's why you have to look at the prior conditions. That's what people miss. And so the only thing else I'll say on Hume that Ehrman criticizes him on is that if you take Hume's methodology, then you would have to throw out so much of academia and science because it relies on that. So first of all, yes, it's true that science is repeatable in that miracles aren't in the same way. Like I don't think you can go and just test prayer every time. But as we said before, there are elements of it that are repeatable, at least as far as the healing goes. So there's at least some credibility to that. And also, there's lots of fields in which we can't repeat. That includes journalism and history, forensic science, where we can't repeat the murder. We can only look at the evidence we do have. So you have DNA left over and blood samples. We can test those, even though we can't reenact the murder, ethically. And same with the healing miracles. We can't see the event itself, but we can test the person now to see if they're healed. So there's fields in which you can do that. And also, there's even most of the social sciences, forget the natural sciences, even social sciences like psychology and sociology are very well known to have a replication crisis where it's very hard to replicate because people have freedom and it's very hard to predict people, and people are just very complex creatures. And so even under similar conditions, people can not do it. So this idea that it has to be this replicability, hard science, and that's the only way we can know it is just false. And again, we're not saying that this competes against it. We're not saying that it's either that the laws of physics exist or miracles happen and we have to pick one, because Hume's saying, well, the laws of physics are better evidence. It's not a competition. It can be both. Yes, God usually maintains laws of physics, but occasionally different conditions happen where miracles happen. There's no contradiction between the two. So that's what we're getting at. And Tim McGrew has a good analogy to this with the way this affects science, when he says we can look at a real life example from the early 1700s where scientists didn't believe that meteorites were a thing. Like, people would come and say they saw rocks fall from the sky, and here you go. But they couldn't, back then they couldn't test the rock to see, that it was different than an Earth rock. And so scientists just thought these people were gullible and crazy, and they were making stuff up that rocks fell from the sky. And so there were literally signed affidavits by people testifying under oath saying, yes, we saw these fall from the sky and it landed in my backyard or whatever. And even at a scientific convention, Laplace, who is, a very well-known astronomer at the time, said, oh, yes, we've heard of such fictions before, these great tales of people seeing rocks from the sky. But of course, now we know that's true. But the idea is that, oh, this contradicts our experience. We just can't trust this testimony of superstitious people. And what I think is funny is that Hume, in that same essay on miracles, talks about how travelers and explorers report back these great, marvelous stories of encountering all these creatures that we know don't exist. And in Hume's day, in the 18th century, Europeans didn't think gorillas existed. They didn't think that giant squid existed. They didn't think that platypuses existed. They'd heard these stories from natives, but they just thought they were stupid, gullible natives. I mean, to put it lightly, that's how they viewed them. And then so they just didn't take it seriously. But of course, now we know that that's obviously wrong. And so if you're going to apply this, we shouldn't just dismiss the testimony because it disagrees with our perception of reality if the testimony is credible. So that's just it's not consistent if you apply that outside of religious claims.
Right.
I think a fair point.
Yeah, and a couple of things. There was a couple of points that I wanted to make. One, I think this is where Aquinas is handy when we talk about, God is, not a being amongst beings. He's being itself. So if everything is sustained by God and God permeates every part of reality, and, the fabric of reality is woven together through the sustaining of God, well, then the laws of physics aren't really anything separate from this sustaining. So there's, of course, if we're within that reality, and God is continuing its existence, well, then anything and everything can be changed, turned, switched, or whatever fluently or fluidly at any time, because it emanates from him. This is his, kind of eminence. Do you agree with Aquinas' view on that, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not like an idealist or that kind of conceptualist, but I think that your point is correct. I would say that under naturalism, there's no reason to even think there would be natural laws at all. You could have chaos for all we know. But under theism, it's decently likely that a good God would want to make a universe that has moral agents in it, right? It's better than an amoral universe that just doesn't have any. It's better than a universe where people are being tortured constantly and there's no goodness. So I think given that, in that moral agents need natural laws to have responsibility, there's a pretty decent probability that God would make a universe with that thing. But under naturalism, that universe could exist by pure chance, but you're going to have a huge range of other possibilities. And it just seems very, very convenient that we happen to get the one that seems more likely under theism. So, I just don't think, I think natural laws already increase the probability of theism. And so I don't think it's very persuasive to say that natural laws somehow hurt the probability of a miracle. Plus, if God wants to get people's attention, you'd have to have natural laws, because if God constantly did miracles or there were no regularities, you wouldn't think twice of anything. If someone walked in water today, or if I drop an apple on the ground and it falls, nobody cares because everyone knows that. But if I drop it and it falls in the other direction, if it falls upward, well, people would notice then. So you're not going to notice unless it stands out, right? So you kind of have to have natural laws to make a message stand out like that. So
you'd probably be upside down, but no.
Yeah, you would.
And this is one of the other points I wanted to make. I actually meant to make this point back at the talking about the methodological naturalism. So miracles by definition are rare.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people aren't familiar that during replication in science, when they're trying to replicate these things, there are anomalies all the time where the replication doesn't give the results that it gave, 90 times before.
Right.
and they're tossed out as a statistical anomaly. So the fact that they remove statistical anomalies, how could you ever find a miracle that way? Because it would just be ruled a statistical anomaly if we
Right.
could, test it and replicate.
Yeah, that's fair. Or if it happened every time where prayer was answered under every circumstance, like that would be a natural law at that point, right? It would be
Right. Yeah.
Or you know what I think would happen is that we would say this would be actually be good evidence of telekinesis, because you could say, well, why are we thinking there's another agent? That's complicated. It's more simple to say that we're the ones doing this. Maybe humans have telekinesis and we want it hard enough and it actually affects physical reality. Maybe that's the hypothesis. And we could prove this every time where I pray, I want this, oh, it happens. Well, that would be good evidence for telekinesis if we could repeat it, right? So I don't know if that would get you to theism if we lived in that kind of world.
Right. And just one more thing before we move on to that one, I want to know what you think about this particular thing. I absolutely hate the natural and supernatural distinction.
Mm-hmm.
I think it comes with so much baggage. It almost blinds people to not even be able to talk about things in a fluid kind of manner. Because everybody has this preconceived idea of natural and supernatural. And not only that, nobody can define natural and supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
It is so ambiguous. It is so vague. It's like when people talk about naturalism, I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? At least give me some idea of what you mean by that. Or supernaturalism. What do you mean by that? Give me some kind of idea about it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think I prefer like material or contingent. I think are better, more specific terms, because I would say natural is like anything that's in the material world that has mass or takes up space or whatever you want to do it, and supernatural would be something that is something that has a mind or that's conscious, but that's not material and not conform to the material world. So that to me is the most general definition I could give for that. But I think that's a fair point. I agree, and I think C.S. Lewis talks all about that. Is I just don't know. I think it's a semantic thing. I don't think people define their terms very well. Because I've heard people say, well, if God existed, God's natural and part of nature. It's like, what does that even mean? It's like what
means they're a pantheist.
Yeah, it's like, well, what does nature mean? How are you just they're just defining nature as anything that exists. And it's like, well, if that's how you're defining nature,
right,
that's not that's not
okay.
fair.
God's part of nature. You just proved God. Thank you.
Yeah. So what does nature even mean then? Yeah. So it just becomes redundant. Okay. So yeah, going on to now, we're going to get into some specific claims.
Yeah, this is
interesting part.
Good stuff.
Yeah, everyone's waiting for. So I mixed these up, but I have a lot of these in the book. So I try to I have like 10 pages on just blindness and all this stuff. So I have different, I do them by categories, by diseases in the book, but we're just going to go through a handful of them. So this first one is a woman named Lynn Whitmore. So Lynn had been suffering from headaches in the early 90s, and she'd had blurred vision. And so when she went to the doctor, they found it was pseudotumor cerebri. And so what that is that it's not actually a disease of the eyes, but it's of the brain. And it's where you have a lot of pressure build up in your brain. So you've probably had really bad migraines before, right? Like imagine that, but like 20 times worse, where it's constant pressure on your head. And what happens in the severe cases of this is that it's actually, imagine like taking a brick and like slowly putting it on like a straw, and that straw is like your optic nerve that connects your eyes. And if you get enough pressure, it'll literally just break it and like sever the nerve. And so at that point, she had severe vision loss. And at one point, it actually like I forget which eye it was, actually was like the optic tract was destroyed. And so at that point, it's irreversible. And so in her medical document from, I believe, March of 1990, her doctor said, quote, yesterday she had onset of facial twitching. She suffered from persistent headaches. She also has vision loss secondary to pseudotumor cerebri, which involves the right eye only. She subsequently lost her vision in the left eye this weekend. She has light perception in the left eye, but could not see forms. And later on, the doctor wrote, her left eye seems to be fading in and out more than before. She has no light perception of the right eye. So she's at least totally blind in one eye and has very bad vision and very impaired vision in the other one. And I believe the right eye was the one where the optic tract was actually severed. So at that point, her doctor says, well, at best we can just stop it from getting worse. But once your nerves of your optic tract have been damaged, that's not reversible. So there's nothing we can do. So that was in 1990. So she then, has to have a cane, and she's legally blind at that point. But late 1991, she goes to she goes to a church service of a pretty well-known evangelist at the time, who prays over her in December 1991. And all of a sudden, she says that she claims that she can see again. And she actually wasn't even prayed over either. I must say that while people were being prayed for on the stage, she was doing her own private prayer. And then she opens her eyes and is like, "Oh my gosh, Mom, I can see." And she puts her hand over her eye. And it's like, "I can see my good eye." And some people say, well, that's just placebo. She just thinks she can see. But then just a few weeks later, about 2 or 3 weeks later, in early January 13th of 1992, she goes to the optometrist and they do it. And she has 20/30 in each eye, which is almost perfect. It's normal for a person, or almost normal, which is, and that's in each eye, which shouldn't be possible if her optic tract was completely severed. She was completely blind in one eye and had severe vision impairment in the other. She had completely 20/30 perfect vision. Her doctor was so surprised that he handed her I read a medical journal that was sitting on his desk. He was like, "Here, read this." And she just starts reading the small font, and he's just like dumbfounded that this is physically possible, because she shouldn't be able to do this with her severed eye. And so she explains, like, "Yeah, I went to this thing and I was prayed for and I could instantly see." And so we have the documentation to cover that. So that's one example of someone who's blind being healed. Now we can do someone who is deaf. This was reported by a Korean physician. I don't want to try to pronounce that name because I'm probably going to butcher it. So there you go. But he's a radiologist in South Korea. And he talks about this one patient of his who had hearing loss. And so this is I forget what it's called. Well, she had chronic otitis media, which is like an ear infection, but she also had a cholesteatoma, which is kind of this like big sack of cells that builds up in time of tissue and cell growth. And so at this top picture in 2011, you can see the black here is the ear canal. And so that's, the way sound travels up to your ear. And so that should be cleared. And so this big blue mass is blocking it. And so this is why she had severe hearing impairment. And so she's prayed for in October 2011, and she feels better, but she still can't hear, and it's still not good. So this picture was taken a few days after she was prayed for, so no change. But then in November of 18th, so about a month later, she goes and she's prayed for by a pastor, and she all of a sudden says, "Oh, I can hear again." And so she doesn't get tested for a while after that, but back in June of 2013, she's been able to hear this whole time, and she goes back for just a regular checkup, and this x-ray showed this time that it's completely cleared. Now, this is notable because a cholesteatoma, if I'm pronouncing that right, is once it gets big enough, it's only removable by surgery. These are not things that just go away naturally, typically, as far as I understand. And so she didn't have any kind of medication or surgery to treat this. And so her doctor was like, was surprised that this was possible, because she didn't have any surgery. So she just tells him, "Yeah, I was prayed for, and I've been able to hear since I was prayed for in November." And her medical tests are consistent with that. So you can see literally the clearing of the ear from here. So I think that's just pretty cool to, have pictures and documentation of that. So before I go on to that, do you have any comments, or was that?
No, that's pretty neat. I would, if you don't mind, afterwards sending me a couple the slides of the actual event that happened.
Yeah, totally. And I have other ones from other presentations and stuff too. Actually, I might just send you like parts of the chapters, the PDFs that I'm still working on. It has way more detail, and I have a lot of footnotes and go into that. So I try to go in to look at the medical literature of each one, and I have a doctor friend who's looking over it.
Everybody else, you have to buy the book.
Whenever it comes out, at some point. But of course, then we get to the grand question of, all these are great, but does God heal amputees, right? This is the atheist impotence. And there's, first of all, before I get into this slide, I would say that there's two things I would say about that. One is, yes, I do have some cases of body parts growing back. I actually have a whole chapter just on this topic. And right now it's in small font. It's almost 50 pages long, because I probably have about 20 pages of anecdotal accounts, second or first hand, of people seeing limbs and fingers grow out. And I go into medically documented cases of organs growing back. So there's a famous case of a guy who had most of his small intestine removed, was prayed for, instantly got it back, and he has the medical documentation to show that. I also know of ones of someone who got he had his right lung removed and 3 ribs because he had a bad cyst that was like making him cough up blood. And so he was prayed for at a Pentecostal service, and he has the x-ray where the lung is literally returned back, and the ribs, which, so, you have like similar things to that. But even if we didn't have that, the question is, why is it this question specifically? Why does it have to be amputee specifically? Where I think the underlying assumption is that, well, with amputees, you can't have a misdiagnosis and there's no ambiguity, and we know it's impossible. And so that would be a true miracle. Whereas other things, there could be misdiagnoses and there could be misunderstandings, or people could lie. And so the quality is different. I think that's partially true, but amputations are not the only miracle that fits that theoretically. You can give lots of examples that would be equally as impossible. For example, if someone had a giant gaping wound that instantly closed in prayer, and you saw this, that not only goes against everything we know in medical science, but that's also not, you can't misdiagnose a gaping wound. Like, that's obvious. It's just as visually obvious as a missing one. Or someone who had a broken bone that was sticking out that instantly healed, or someone who was morbidly obese that instantly lost, the fat literally melted off of them as they were being prayed for, or someone with cataracts and melting away. So any of these very visual things that can be seen would be equally as impressive and equally as impossible. So we shouldn't just act as if amputations are the only specific one. And I think that ideology is bad, because you could have it where, for example, with young Earth creationists, they want to say, I want a specific transitional fossil for these two. And they're like, well, we don't have that one, but we have all these other transitional fossils. Say, yeah, but but we need a transitional one for this specifically, and we need one for that one. Any fossil you find, they're like, but what's the transition between that one? So they want all transitional fossils. And so the point is, you can't look at evidence to say, okay, yeah, there's the evidence, but what about this potential evidence? We have to look at the evidence that we do have. So you can't hand wave away to say, yeah, but we don't have this specifically. If the evidence we have is good, then that is. And so it just depends on that. But anyway, the actual historical question, there is at least one good documented case from a couple hundred years ago of an amputee getting a leg back. There are more modern ones that are more anecdotal. And I won't go into this. I already have a whole YouTube video if you want to look at that, where I go into more detail. I talk about this for probably 20 pages in the book in very excruciating detail. So I'm going to be very brief here. But it was of a Spanish named Miguel Piecer. He had his right leg amputated in 1637 because he had a farming accident where a cart ran over his leg and it was gangrene. And so by the time he goes to the hospital, they have to cut it off and they bury it. And he becomes a licensed beggar for 2.5 years. So he gets a permit. They verify he's disabled. He begs for 2 years, and he would rub the lamp oil from the church, from the cathedral. He would beg out in front of on his wound every night, and cry out to the Virgin Mary, because it's a very Catholic Spain, to heal him. And so one day when he goes back home to Calanda, his parents find him and they wake him up, and they see that his leg is now returned. Everyone freaks out and declares a miracle. The Catholic Church then gets involved and investigates this. And the earliest account we have is 3 days after this happened. We have someone who was curious and goes there, and he writes down the testimonies of 10 people. And then they take this to the bishop. The bishop then 2 months later wants an official investigation. So they conduct an investigation for 11 months, and they interview 24 more witnesses, including the people there were 2 doctors who amputated the leg and treated it for several months. There was one hospital staffer who buried the leg. They interviewed his family. They interviewed people who saw him as a beggar. And so we have testimony of about almost 40 people at least, saying, yeah, I knew Miguel. I saw he didn't have a leg, or I helped cut the leg off and bury this. And we have all of this contemporary eyewitness testimony, including from the doctors. And they go to the place where the leg was buried in the hospital court, because it was common to bury it back then. And they saw the leg was gone, but the leg had returned onto him, and it had the same birthmarks and stuff, but it had a big scar from where the amputation was. And so they actually declared this a miracle, and it became famous. And even a lot of Protestants who hated the Catholics met Miguel and were convinced by this. So the point is, we have a lot of firsthand testimony. And what's really funny is that David Hume actually mentions this in his essay. If you go read his essay on miracles, he alludes to this, where he's like, yeah, there's a story about a Spaniard in Spain who got a leg back. And Hume says, and we have so many witnesses to this, a great many witnesses, all fervent and stuff. And Hume says, but we know this didn't happen. And we know that this was a fraud, and we don't have to prove that it was a fraud. We can just do this because we know that any human testimony is not going to be sufficient. We know this can't happen. And so I don't have to go investigate this and prove that it didn't happen. I can just hand wave this away because I know this can't happen. So Hume basically brags of saying we shouldn't have to go and investigate this because we know that it's fraudulent just because of the nature of it. And so that's, I think, the circular nature of Hume's argument. But
I love the way that this question's always posed. Does God heal amputees? Why would he not heal them just because they're an amputee?
Right.
He heals other people. So if one person, has a chronic disease, why would he not heal an amputee with a chronic disease?
Mm-hmm.
Because they typically mean, they mean, why doesn't he make the limbs grow back?
Right.
But they always phrase it as, why doesn't God heal amputees?
Right.
He's not, prejudiced against amputees.
Funny
He'll
enough, I
heal.
have I have a case in the book of a modern one in the 80s of a woman who she'd had a disease where she had to get amputated, and it was like a severe swelling of her legs, and she was healed of that disease, but her leg didn't grow back. And so it's like, yeah, she was healed as an amputee, but not that case. But you're right, like it just depends on what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say earlier you didn't give me a break to pop in and make.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No. Earlier, to pop in and make my dumb joke, so I let it go. But I was going to say, when you were talking about partial healing as being one of the criteria, I'd be like, that would suck if people had 2 lame legs and God only healed one.
Yeah.
That's,
you're only partially healed.
Yeah, it's like, here, I'll give you half. I'll tell you now, God has definitely got a sense of humor, so I wouldn't put it past them.
Yeah, or if Miguel got it like the leg back, but it was like the stump, like he got it, but he didn't get the foot back. Like it was up to the leg where the foot would be. But it was
that would
That'd be
suck.
weird.
It'd be like, here you go, here's most of it back.
Yeah. So that's true. But yeah, so that's, if you want more on that, I have a whole video on it. I have a blog post on it as well on Think Christian Theism, and I'll have it in the chapter. So it's one of my favorite ones because very well evidenced historically. So look into that. All right, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but testimony's not trustworthy.
Yeah, right, exactly. Last thing we'll say on here, as a transition from that, is the Catholic investigations of the miraculous. So I'm open to saying that I'm a Protestant and that I don't believe in certain a lot of Catholic dogmas. And so I admit in the book, I say, I don't know theologically what to do with these. I'm open to, I don't think, I think Catholics are Christians. I don't like when really Reformed people act like they're not. So I don't have an issue with God answering the prayers of Catholics or doing this. And so they will attribute this to saints. And although I don't necessarily believe in that, I think I'm going to speak very positively of the Catholic Church in this section, because I think there's a lot that can be said as far as the meticulous nature of it that I think can be commended. So when the Catholic Church wants to make someone a saint, there's lots of criteria. The person had to have a really honorable life as a Catholic, that, whether they were a nun or they worked with charity or whatever. So all this stuff. So let's say Eddie Kroom converts to Catholicism. He becomes a monk. He goes out and does some great charity work, does all this stuff, serves the church well, and dies. So how does Eddie then become a Catholic, become a saint? Well, first of all, someone would petition for, hey, I think Eddie should be a saint. They would have a commission go and look at your life to see, was he a good person? Did he have any scandals? Did he live an honorable life? And if you pass that, you'll be venerable. That's the stage, you're venerable. So to move up from venerable to actually be like beatified as a saint, you have to have at least 2 miracles in your intercession. So how this works is that someone would pray for you, and they would say, oh, dear God, heal my son. And they would say, dear Eddie, please ask, God on your intercession to heal my boy. And so there would have to be at least 2 medically inexplicable healings that pass all the criteria that we listed earlier for the Vatican to affirm this, and they have to have a panel of doctors to investigate this and to see if there's any natural explanation. So the best source on this is Dr. Jacqueline Duffin's book, which I have here, called Medical Miracles, Doctor, Saints, and Healing. She's a hematologist who's like the president of several medical centers in Canada, pretty well known. And what's interesting is that she's actually an atheist. She's still an atheist, but she does research on Catholic healing miracles in this like saint context. And how she got interested in that is because back in the 1980s, when she was a hematologist, she had someone come up and asked her to look into a case of a woman who had a very bad version of leukemia. And so she looked at this slide and was like, oh, she thought it was for a lawsuit. She didn't know it was for it. And she's like, oh, this person must be dead because this leukemia is like, it remitted once, it came back, and it's already spread, so there's no way it could survive. And then she saw the other slides and was like, no, this person was like instantly healed. And she was like, really? Like, is this a miracle or a lawsuit? And the person's like, a miracle. And they explained to her that the Vatican was actually reviewing this case because this woman had been prayed for on a particular, I forget the saint, it was like Duval or something, it was Canada's first saint. She had been prayed for at her intercession and was instantly healed of leukemia. And they had wanted Dr. Duffin's medical opinion on this. They didn't tell her what it was for. And Dr. Duffin's like, and they're like, we'd like you to go speak at her canonization and testify under oath in your medical opinion. And Dr. Duffin's like, well, I'm an atheist. And they're like, well, that's fine. We don't care. We just care that you're a doctor. All we want is your medical opinion. And so she does this, and she says, like, yes, as a doctor, this is medically inexplicable. And so then that got her interested in this. And so she actually asked the Vatican, and they let her review for, I think, between 1500 to the modern day, like all of their canonization miracles. And so that's what she talks about in the book as far as these medically documented cases. So she still says that she doesn't believe in God, but she thinks that many of these are genuinely inexplicable. And she thinks the church does a very good job as far as like investigating these and asking doctors who don't have to have a religious affiliation to look into these and to give their medical opinion. So that whole process is very interesting. I would recommend that. So like, let's give one example. Okay. So Consiglia de Martino. So on October 31st, she'd start to felt a pain in her neck and her stomach and her chest, like that area. And it got, first she rubbed it off, but it got really, really bad. And so on November 1st, she wakes up and her neck has, you can imagine how bad it has swollen to the size of a grapefruit. This picture down here is not of her, but it is of what it would have been. A goiter as big as, grapefruits are big as that. So she obviously is like, oh my gosh, I have to go to the emergency room immediately. And so she does, and they do x-rays, and it shows that her thoracic duct in her neck had been ruptured. And so there was 2 liters. I mean, think of like a 2-liter like drink, like that's a lot of fluid had leaked out and was getting onto that. And so
gross.
they're like, you're going to have to get surgery immediately because this is going to be fatal. And so before that, she goes that same day and she goes to the grave. This is in Italy. She goes to the grave of Padre Pio, who is a very well-known Catholic mystic, and goes to his grave and prays on his intercession. Oh, Father Pio, on your intercession, please heal me. Her surgery is scheduled for November 3rd, but this is on November 1st. The next day, she wakes up the next day, November 2nd, it's completely gone. All of the goiter completely goes away. And on the next day after that, November 3rd, when she's actually looked at by the doctors, because she comes in for the surgery, and they're like, what happened to your goiter? And she's like, it's gone. And so they do the x-rays, and all the liquid is gone, and the duct is now healed. And so she stayed at the hospital a few days just as a precaution, but she had been healed from that day. And so her doctors were interviewed. These are pictures of her medical files. They're in Italian, but you can see them. So her doctors were interviewed. There was a panel of, I think, 5 doctors who looked into it. And they all said, yeah, this is medically not possible, because even if the body could absorb fluid, it can't do it that fast overnight and heal itself in that way. And so, especially without surgery, so this is just not, it was instantaneous. It was complete. They have to, wait a while to make sure that she stays healed. And so because of this intercession miracle, along with one other one, because you have to have these 2, Padre Pio was eventually canonized in 2002. This happened in the 95. So they wait a few years and they take this to the Vatican. Once the Vatican affirms that this is medically inexplicable, that goes in the file, and they officially canonize you as a saint who is now in heaven and can answer prayers on intercession. So that's part of how that process works. And that's interesting. Last one we'll talk about here is Lourdes. Lourdes does this process, but they're not officially with the Vatican. Lourdes is a site in France because in 1858, there was a young girl named Bernadette who claimed that the Virgin Mary appeared to her on multiple occasions. And apparently the Virgin Mary showed her this grotto of water that had healing properties. And so ever since then, millions of people come every year to get to this very famous Catholic shrine pilgrimage site in Lourdes, France. And you can see these back down here. These are like the baths of the grotto of the water that sick people go into to try to feel better. So between 1858, there's been 70 official miracles. Now, that's actually not a lot considering how many people go there every year, but they're pretty scrupulous. But there's about 2,500 other ones that are considered very impressive or very inexplicable. And so they actually have a medical bureau set up in Lourdes, and they're pretty scrupulous. And they have the bureau there to investigate these claims because so many people were claiming to be healed. They're like, well, we should look at these. And a lot of them are thrown out because they're not well evidenced. So the bureau requires that you have to have medical documentation that you were sick. So if you just say, oh, I'm healed, they're like, oh, great, can we talk to your doctor and stuff, and you don't comply to turn over all your records, they're not going to look into it. The healing has to be, instantaneous. It has to be complete, and all the criteria we said earlier. And they usually wait at least 10 years. So you have to do a follow-up the year after they look into it, and then they have to do another follow-up several years after it. And they want to make sure that you're still healed. The cancer doesn't come back. You don't get sick again of that disease. Not that you can never get sick again, but that you're in good health and that nothing in your condition ever came back. And at that point, they, if you pass all of those, then they take it to your bishop of your diocese and they say, in our opinion, this is medically inexplicable. Do with that what you will. And then the bishop is the one who actually says, this is a miracle by the Virgin Mary or whatever. And so the Vatican doesn't take a position on these, but the local bishop's the one who decide these based on the opinion of the medical bureau. And like the Vatican investigations, the bureau is not all made up of Catholics. Some of them are atheists, some of them are Protestants, some of them are Catholics. They just have to be credentialed. And I think there's about 30 doctors on that bureau of different disciplines. So notably, Lourdes has had especially in the early 1900s, there were skeptics who went there who ended up being converted, which is kind of cool. So Alexis Carrel was a doctor who was on a train going to Lourdes, and there was a girl who was literally dying. I don't remember what condition she had, like tuberculosis. And after she goes in the grotto, she was completely healed, and the swelling went down. And he was impressed by this, and he would actually go on to win the Nobel Prize and stuff. So he was a pretty well-respected doctor. But even at his institution, when he affirmed this and said, "Yeah, this is impressive and inexplicable," he got a lot of flack to where he actually moved to America. Because people were like, "Oh, how dare such a man? You know, he's gullible. He believes in the supernatural." Even though he won the Nobel Prize, pretty smart guy. But he'd gotten a lot of flack by this, and he stood by his position to say, and he ended up converting to Catholicism. But he stood by his position to say that I think this is impressive and that there's something to this. So you have scientific pushback. And Emile Zola, who's pictured here, is the most famous critic of Lourdes, and he got really lucky because usually there's a cure is only declared every few decades, like once or twice every few decades, because they're pretty rare now because the Bureau throws out most of them. But the one time Emile Zola visited Lourdes, and this is like in 1890 or 1891, he was there there was one weekend between, I believe, August 20th and 21st, where 3 different people were healed almost the same time. And this is like, the 14th, 15th, and 16th miracle of Lourdes. The only time it's ever happened where it's happened all within one weekend. And Zola was there for this, and Zola was the skeptic. And so this included a woman who had she'd had a huge wound on her foot that was eating away at her bone. And her doctor had signed a statement a week before she went to Lourdes, like saying, "Oh, she's in bad health. I don't recommend she does this. She has a gaping wound," all that stuff. When she comes out of the pool, there were literally people, the 2 nurses there literally saw the wound close in front of their eyes. And when the Bureau looked at it the same day, it was just a scar. And so they looked at her medical things. "Oh, you had a gaping wound. We have eyewitnesses," all this stuff. And Zola sees this. And there was another similar one to that Zola saw. And this, I think, was pretty impressive, of a woman named Marie. And Marie had lupus and huge ulcers on her face. So like imagine like big flesh-eating sores that were eating away at her lips. So she barely had a lip, and she didn't have a nose, because the cartilage was eaten away. And they said that she looked horrific and didn't even look like a human, because like it was like huge facial disfigurements. She would wear a veil because she was embarrassed to be seen in public. And so she goes there. She also has a note written by her doctor. When she first goes there, one of the doctors at Lourdes was horrified by how she looked and recommended that she covered it with the veil. But after she goes and the water comes out, all of that is completely covered with pink, fresh skin, and it heals naturally within a few days. And, again, that's not, facial disfigurement completely healed, like almost instantly. And Zola sees all of this, and Zola writes this down in his book on Lourdes. And his book is a novel, so it's a fictionalization. He changes the names of the characters, but it's based off of his events. And so he writes in his novel that these things happen, and he doesn't deny they happened, but he's like, yes, but afterwards the patients got sick again and died, and all this was psychosomatic in their head. And when he publishes, the doctors at Lourdes were like, "Emile, why would you say that? Because we have them right here, and they didn't die." And Emile's response was, "Well, as an author, I have creative freedom to change the story how I want, and I don't have to believe that this actually happened." And so Emile Zola was famous for saying, even if I saw everyone cured at Lourdes, I wouldn't believe. Even if I saw someone who didn't have a finger stick their hand in the water, come out and had a finger, I still wouldn't believe. And so he was also accused of actually trying to pay off the woman who had the facial disfigurement to keep quiet, to pretend so she wouldn't be publicly come out and say "Yeah, I'm not dead. I'm right here. I'm healed." And so he got a lot of flack for that. But that just goes to show the kind of pushback in these debates that were going on. But you have skeptics who were not denying these people were healed, but we're just like, well, it's hysteria or whatever. So just the history behind that side is very, very compelling. But all that goes to show, all that we went over is that there are some really interesting cases like this that have medical documentation. And I think they're worth looking into, and a lot of them have been scrupuloused. So in conclusion, we can say that many well-documented events have occurred in religious contexts. We can say that theist explanations on some occasions have better explanatory power than the naturalistic ones. And we can say that in some of these cases, these probably do have a theistic explanation. Therefore, God most probably exists based off of that. So, we established the argument. We gave examples of events that have that could be miracles and why God's better explanation. So that concludes the presentation. But yeah, I didn't know if you have any other comments. I know I was talking there
Rock
for a while.
on, man. That was fantastic. Man, I have so many questions.
Great. Do you have any questions in the audience or anything, or is it?
I'm waiting on some to come in. There were some earlier. Let's look at let's see. Question for Caleb. Oh, come on, Travis. Always, man.
Travis Worth, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's his. You'll see when I get his
Oh,
question
no.
up here.
Oh.
I was on the wrong screen finding the question. Dummy. Can't highlight it in that one. I love Travis's approach to epistemology. We're similar, but
Travis is a smart guy.
oh, he is. Yeah,
He is.
too smart for his own good. I'm gonna read them for the podcast listeners. Travis Lee, question for Caleb: is abductive inference to the best explanation the best method for evaluating miracle claims?
I would say so, because I don't think you can make a straight deductive argument. Other like the one we can give as far as how we would investigate it, but I think for any given case, it's a probability issue, not a logical, solidity issue. So yes, I would say inference the best explanation is the approach that I would take, and the approach I've been trying to take in this presentation.
Do you know? I wonder if one could formulate a Bayesian.
I think you could. I kind of want to try to do that. I have to talk with people who do Bayes more, but I've been wanting to do something to say, like to give an example of where we have. So like Craig Keener estimates there's about 200 million miracle claims on Earth today. That's not even counting the historical ones, but we'll be generous and just count the ones today. And I will be generous and say that let's say 99.5% of those are not credible. So let's only say 0.5% of those are from like eyewitnesses, and these are things that are not easily misdiagnosed and stuff like that. So like out of that 0.5%, you still get a million. That's still a million cases out of 200 million. So out of those million, let's assume that all the witnesses, you're going to have some witnesses that are really credible, some that are not. So let's assume out of those, each person has an average probability of being 95% probability of being honest and not lying, any given thing. So given all of that, and we can start with a pretty low prior of like 10 to the negative, 5 or something, 10 to the negative 4, 10 to the negative 5, like pretty low prior. We have to ask, what's the probability that all of those claims, the million that we're using, in each of those claims has a 95% chance of someone being honest telling it. Well, the probability that all of those that are naturally explicable and that none of those are miraculous. I think that the probability, I haven't put the numbers in yet, but I think that would be pretty high in favor of at least one of those being like legitimately a miracle, even if that get pretty low prior for the sake of argument.
And to kind of highlight a point for those that are listening may not be real familiar with Bayesian. People like to bring up the problem of the priors, but it's not necessarily always a problem, because you can start out with an extremely low prior probability, and with background knowledge and enough evidence, you could still come out top heavy on the hypothesis of miracles. And at the end of the day, you don't have to get to 0.5 or more for it to be plausible, or it's any competing hypothesis. So if it comes out at 0.3 and all other competing hypotheses, including naturalism, is below 0.3, well, then that means it's the most probable explanation. And a lot of people, because they think you got to come out like 0.5 or more to be. I mean, technically, if you want to say you have to have a number to say that it's probable, yeah, you want something pretty high. But if we're using competing hypotheses, which is what Bayesian's for, as long as it's the more probable, then that's the more probable outcome.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I wanted to highlight this one because I think Pasta Mike did a pretty good job when I was talking about the difference between natural and supernatural. He uses it as natural, existing in or caused by nature. That would still be the kind of ambiguity, but it's still, I know more of what he means by it, and can be tested with scientific methodological naturalism. That's fine. Supernatural being an event attributed to some force beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature. I think it's a pretty decent, succinct.
Yeah, and I don't think that. Again, I agree that we can't test the supernatural like strictly, but I think you can test the supernatural if it affects nature. So we can't test like what God's thinking, but if God interacts into nature, I think we can notice that interaction and test that scientifically. So we can test it if God is putting his hands into the nature, but if God is never interacted with nature, then we couldn't test it. So miracles are just testing whether or not God has intervened into nature at that specific point.
Yeah, and this is a question from him.
Mhm.
It's for me. Eddie, do you think it's metaphysically possible? Because earlier in the chat, he asked me what I thought about limbs growing back. And I said, it's metaphysically possible, highly unlikely.
Mhm.
And I would be a skeptic either way. Doesn't mean, there's not enough there that wouldn't convince me. But metaphysically possible that your hair can regrow if you start going to church on Sunday and tithing your 20%. Why did you add 10 more percent to that, man? What
I
church
know
are you
he's
going
going
to?
above and beyond. Yeah.
Yeah, Pasta, you need to stay out of those atheist churches. They're robbing you.
Well, if God grows your hair back, I think you owe him a 10 more percent. I think it's worth that.
Well, here's the thing. I'm not actually bald. I'm just thinning, and I don't like it. So
I agree. If I was thinning, I would just shave. You look better. Just shave it all off. Don't wear the thinning. Just either.
Yeah, once you get a tan on it and you don't have the little white dome.
It looks good. I couldn't even tell where you shaved it, like the point. So that's pretty good blending.
Yeah, look how shiny it is.
Yeah.
Look at that. Now that's so actually that's a an effects or an aesthetic trick that I learned from Pasta Mike. He's the artist, and he was talking about having light shine on the head, and I like it. He's right. It does look better. So I have a few questions.
Okay.
Most of these questions I think you that are in the chat were answered throughout the show, and there was a lot of a bunch of back and forth, which was great engagement. What are your thoughts on charismatic healings?
So the first two that I taught, the one with the blindness and the deafness were both charismatic Pentecostal settings, and the last ones were Catholic. So it's kind of funny that a lot of charismatics, like when I tell them what I'm doing, they're like, "Oh, that's really cool," and they like it. But I've had people who went to charismatic churches that say, "Oh, you're being too critical. We can't test God. You need to have more faith." Because I also spend a lot of time, debunking or showing why other ones aren't. And so I think that most charismatic healings are probably psychosomatic. I think, when people go up there and they can reach their arms, "Oh, I don't have pain. I don't have arthritis," and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, those aren't persuasive to me. And I think that you can explain those easily. So I'm open to them. And I even had some examples. So there are some well-documented ones, but you have to just look at it a case-by-case basis. And there's a good group called the Global Medical Research Institute, GMRI, by Dr. Kanye Gunther Brown from Indiana University, actually, where I went to. And they document cases like this. I think she is Pentecostal. I could be wrong on that, but she's not like an apologist. She's not very open about her religious beliefs. But they actually did a study where they went to Mozambique and tested people who were blind and deaf, or at least hearing impaired and sight and visually impaired, and they went to a Pentecostal meeting and they were prayed for, and they recovered again. Actually, since you brought it up, that reminds me, I was going to do this earlier and I forgot about it. But there was one interesting case in Denmark that I recently learned about and what was interesting about it is it was this faith healer from, I believe, Nigeria, who had come and had been praying for people. In this Danish television show was doing a special on it. And people were getting up and being healed, and they thought that he must have plants in the audience, right? These people are pretending to be sick, and they're on his pay grade and stuff like that. So they had someone from their staff go in secretly who was a adult. They didn't. The audience members didn't know he was in on it. So he actually had visual impairments. You can see. I don't know how well you can see in that picture. He has the eye patch and stuff that's in the book.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't actually directly prayed for, but at the end of the service, the guy asked, "Does anyone want to accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior?" And so I think he had been this is Denmark. Most people are secular. I think he had been that. So he comes up and says the prayer. And then after he says the prayer, he realizes he can see. And this guy is on their team. So he's not in on it. And so he's like, "Wait a minute, I think I can actually see." And so they're like, "Well, it's a placebo." So then they go to the doctor, and you can see this is like the sight test they did, but it basically showed that his eyesight had completely come back. And so that's kind of a cool case of them trying to like debunk a guy and end up being like, "Oh my gosh, our guy's actually healed."
What? Yeah. So, why would it be placebo though if there's no convincing? Because
right. I mean, he didn't believe.
It's kind of like, that kills the placebo right there.
Right. Yeah.
So all right. So the next one would be, What about miracle claims of other religions?
Hmm.
Have you seen any of those, and did they look legit? Or
Yeah, so I have a chapter on that as well. I think that's usually besides the amputee question, that's the one that comes up the most as far as well, what about even Hume brings it up where they all cancel each other out. They can't all be right. So God's confusing people. And I think I would say two things. One is that I think God would have two reasons for doing a miracle. One is an act of charity to help someone, and I think in those cases that applies to any religion. I think that God meets people where they're at, and I don't think that God's going to say, no, you're a Muslim or a Hindu, I'm not going to cure you of your cancer. Like I'm only going to answer Christian prayers. I think that's just not the view of God I have. And I think it's perfectly plausible that an all-loving God would answer the prayers of any religion, like someone who's in help or sick or something. So if it's a healing claim, I don't have any let's assume that it's well documented. If there was good evidence, I don't have an issue with that. I think that. And the second kind of miracle claims that I'm more concerned about are the vindication ones of a prophet, like things that don't really help anyone, but are just like walking on water or floating or turning water into wine, or something where it's more of a show-offy, calling fire from heaven, like a more of a show-offy thing that doesn't really like help someone in need, but it's just I'm a prophet, I'm with God, here's God proving that. And I think those are God would only do for specific religions. I don't think he would do that. I think if it was done, it would be by a different entity. So I think that's why God rose Jesus from the dead, and why prophets and even in the book of Acts and in the Old Testament were able to do miracles of that kind. So I haven't seen any, with maybe one or two exceptions. Most cases of other religions of that kind, I don't think are very convincing. You'll have like reincarnation claims or claims of statues drinking milk, but most of them are not very, very well documented. And so I think out of those claims, I would say Christianity does much better with the vindication claims. And the last thing I'll say on that is that I think that what's interesting is that although Christianity is not the only religion to have miracle claims, Christianity is the only religion that can say that some people like J.P. Moreland says that it is a majority, but at least a very large portion statistically of their converts are because of miracles. So this isn't so much in the Western world, but Craig Keener.
right, yeah. Oh, I love Craig Keener. Yeah, I know who he did. Yeah, he did a lot on it. Yeah.
A large portion of his book is just people of statistics and stories of people being converted in like India or parts of Africa or parts of China. And some of these are very large numbers. Like one estimate in China was 50 to 90% of converts, especially in rural areas, convert because of faith healing experiences. I think there was one study in the Philippines he cites where it was like 80% of people who converted were because of healing experiences. In India, 10% of non-Christians, like of people who weren't Christians, said that they saw Christians healing other people and then were witnesses. So you have very large ones, and you have these like power encounters where you'll have like there was actually a dissertation done on a tribe in India because the chief's son had died of this tribe, and they prayed to Vishnu and all their gods, and nothing had happened. And so a Christian missionary comes and prays for the son comes back from the dead instantly. And almost everyone in that tribe who was Hindu for hundreds, if not thousands of years, converted to Christianity. And so I think in those cases you have converts. And so I'm not saying that no one's ever been converted for American or other religion, but it's not statistically significant from what I can tell. And it also goes into a whole section of my book where I talk about visions of Jesus in the modern world, because I don't think that gets the attention it deserves. And it's like it's open secret in apologetics, because I feel like everyone you ask who's a Christian is like, oh, did you know that there's stories about Muslims having dreams of Jesus? And they're like, oh yeah, I've heard about that. I'm like, but why hasn't like anyone like done this apologetically? Like, that's really interesting. And so I try looking at this, and there are studies that have as high as 25% of Muslim converts convert because of a vision of Jesus. In some countries, it's as high as 30%. So it's very widespread. And so you have to ask, what Jesus, if you're talking about miracles in other religions, why is it that Muslims and Hindus are saying Jesus, but not the other way around? You don't have Christians because they see Krishna or something. So that, I think, to me, would be better evidence for Christianity. And so people will then say, well, Christianity is the most widespread, and so they're most familiar with it, and so it's not surprising. But it's also like, well, but you don't see it with Catholicism, because Catholicism has actually maybe either equally or more missionaries than most Protestants do, and yet you don't see, at least to my knowledge, there's not that many cases of non-believers seeing the Virgin Mary. There are lots of cases of Catholics seeing the Virgin Mary, but most people who see the Virgin Mary are already Catholics, whereas a lot of people who see Jesus are not Christians. And so it's like, well, so you kind of have to explain that dichotomy. And in some of these cases, people are healed. I have lots of medically documented cases of people being healed when Jesus appears. And sometimes in the vision, Jesus will tell them the date they will be healed, and they are healed. Or there was one case of a Muslim woman named Gulshan Esther, who was I believe Pakistani, and she was crippled from a young age because she had polio. This was like back in like the 70s, and we treat polio now, but this is in developing country back in the 70s. They didn't have top tier medical, so she had been really sick, and they took her to London to see a doctor. But at that point, she was already like, you're like, well, we can't do anything. You're already your paralysis is already happening. Your nerves are already destroyed, and so she was like crippled for all the way in her teen years. And then she as even though she was a Muslim, she would pray to Allah to heal her. Nothing happened. And then she would read in the she'd never read a Bible before, but in the Quran, Isa does heal people. And so she's like, well, Allah, can you have, Jesus heal me or something? And so one night in her bed, Jesus appears to her glowing, and she also sees 12 other men who, you could assume are the disciples appear. And Jesus tells her, Gulshan, I love you. Please follow me. And he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And she had never heard that before because she'd only read the Quran. And so he touches her, and she gets up and starts walking. And her mom then hears her footsteps, and she's like, Gulshan, who is in your bedroom? And she's like, it's me, Mom. And she's like, no, you can't walk. You're a cripple. And she opens the door and almost faints when she sees Gulshan running around. And Gulshan has been healed ever since. And so she went and told her testimony and all that stuff.
Wow.
Yeah. And so you'll have stories like that. You'll have stories where people convert and they get severely persecuted, and it's really sad. But so really humbling living in America. There's a guy who converted a Muslim who converted after seeing Jesus, and his family tried to kill him. There's one of a Hindu girl who was she would quote unquote channel spirits in her of these like snake goddesses in India as a Hindu family. And her parents would make money off of her because people would come and I guess she would give prophecies or do spiritual stuff. But she had a vision of Jesus and she converted to Christianity, and then her people stopped paying her. And so her dad got so mad that he tied her to a tree and beat her senselessly until she was almost blackened out and basically disowned her. So Christians in a lot of these countries are really converting that. So I don't doubt that these people are sincere. And I don't think in a lot of these cases they have any reason to lie, because I think they are genuinely putting their life on the line. So I think there's a lot that can be said about that. So that's just an interesting area of study, I think.
Yeah. And here's a little interesting true fact. I'm a Christian because I saw Mother Mary in my toast.
yeah. Nice. People do see Jesus in their toast sometimes.
I know, yeah. It's
I think they actually make toasters that have that where it does that for you now.
Oh, that's crazy. Like an imprint.
Yeah, it's based off of that, yeah.
So I'm knowing Pasta Mike, he's probably serious about this or tongue in cheek, but I think it's a decent question. If a person was loved by a Hindu and a Christian, fell ill, and recovered from what appeared to be a miracle, if the Hindu and the Christian prayed, how do you know which God it was?
In that particular example, I don't think you could. So that's why the examples I gave, if someone wasn't healed in one case but was healed in the other, or if all the healings seem to be for the purpose of, if they are specifically to convert the person, I think there'd be better evidence for Christianity. But in just any general case, if you had all of them, I don't think you could know. And it also depends, the whole point of being instantaneous is not just that we pray for them and they get better. It's like if it was at the moment. So if they got immediately better after the Christian one or after the Hindu one, that might affect it a little bit. But just with those details, I don't think you could really know.
Yeah, he messed that one up because he could have added a Muslim in there too and made it even more.
All three, Muslim and Christian, go to a bar.
Well, no, okay. Well, no, actually, he did pretty good because he did not two Abrahamic religions. He did one. Yeah. So out of all of them, this is the last question. I want to let you get back to your fun, interesting evening. Out of all of the miracle claims, which one was the most shocking or surprising? Not necessarily super well attested, but kind of on the fence about, or something like that. Can you remember?
Gosh, I do get that question, and it's just like I always hard because I feel like every time I answer it, it's like, oh, I could have said that one. So yeah, I don't know. I think the amputee one that I brought up earlier is really still my favorite. I think just because of the impossibility of it and the witnesses you have to it. There's one case of a woman, and Fan Christophilus did a video on this recently. of a woman named Barbara Snyder, and this was Lee Strobel talks about this as well, who had multiple sclerosis. But basically, long story short, she was like not only paralyzed, but also had her fingers were curled up and her feet were curled up, and they would have to get like a knife and like pry her hands open just to clean the cells off, and just to, she could put slippers on and stuff. But she couldn't walk. She was legally blind. She was on a ventilator because her lung had collapsed and her diaphragm was paralyzed. So she was in horrible condition, and it got worse and worse. She had a catheter, and she was like in her 30s. And so in the early 80s, she was in hospice care, and her doctors were like, okay, she's on do not resuscitate now, and she's not going to be coming back if something happens to her within the next 6 months. So basically, they get a radio station together and they pray for her. And shortly after that, on her sister's birthday, as they're sitting in her living room, she hears a voice that she thinks is the voice of Jesus. It says, "My child, get up and walk." And so she's like, well, here goes nothing. So she stands up, steps out, realizes for the first time she looks down, she says, "My feet are not curled up anymore." Then she says, "Wait a minute, I can see." I can actually see for the first time. Then she sees her hands are no longer curled up. Then she takes the ventilator out of her mouth and starts breathing again. Then her family rushes in like, "Oh my gosh, Barbara." And they hug her, and her mom grabs her leg and says, "Barbara, you have calf muscles now." She hadn't walked in 2 years. And so,
wow,
and this was in a period of like a few minutes, like within a few minutes, she
major atrophy. There's no,
yes. And she sees that. So she goes to her church that night, and like, people are like, "Oh my gosh, is that Barbara?" They'd only seen her in a wheelchair, and like, they'd never seen her like walking. And her doctor sees her the very next day. And he says that when he saw her walking in the hallway, he thought he was seeing her ghost because that she had died and was seeing like that. And so he was amazed. So they do the x-ray, and not only did they see that the muscles came back, that she was completely there, her eyesight came back. They did the x-ray, and her lung was now no longer collapsed. Her diaphragm wasn't paralyzed. They took the catheter out. So that was all within like a few seconds.
Wow.
And so the speed of that is like, and her doctor, there were at least 2 doctor tests, and they're like, yeah, there's no medical explanation for this. So I think that one is just when I'm just like, wow, like that's really crazy. So that's another one. The last one I'll say is one that bothers me a little bit for the theology behind it, but there are a handful of Marian apparitions, particularly in Egypt, that I think are super interesting. So there's a couple of cases, and Egypt is notable because in the Gospel of Matthew, they go to Egypt to flee from Herod. Yeah. So Coptic Christians believe
there's a lot of Coptic Christians there.
Yeah, there are. And in this particular spot, this was one of the places they traditionally thought Mary crossed through. But there was this light figure that appeared on top of a Coptic church in the late 60s, early 70s, routinely, like several times a month, sometimes for like 3 years. And everyone saw this. There's photographs of it online. This was in the local newspapers. There were about 10,000 witnesses to this. People claim they were healed by this, and doctors looked into it. The Egyptian government, which was pro-Muslim and didn't really like the Coptics, shut down all the power in the city, but the light was still there. They couldn't find any projection device within a 15-mile radius. And so the point is, like, no one has any idea of what this was. Best explanation that was proposed was like earthquake lights, but that was criticized because it's not consistent, and it's always on top of the same church at night, which is not how random natural lights work. You think it'd be kind of all over the place. So the point is, like, no one has a good explanation to this. I don't have a good explanation to it. On the one hand, it's a very compelling case, but on the other hand, I don't necessarily think Mary was assumed into heaven, and so I kind of admit my biases there. But right. I think that one's kind of fun for that reason, for me to have to be like, well, shoot, I don't know. That's interesting though. Yeah.
Well, Caleb, thank you so much for bringing that. Man, such great. In fact, I've actually, on Discord, listened to one of your presentations, and this was cool because it wasn't the exact same thing.
I've seen that a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, no, fantastic work, man. I'm definitely be looking for the book coming out eventually. I know that's a long process. Yeah. Do you have any sites, any channels, anything that you want to plug before you go?
No, I mean, I have a small YouTube channel, but that's just Caleb Jackson. But there's Faith Unaltered, which is I sometimes co-host with David Russell and Tyler Flower now. And Travis is on there sometimes as well. So check that out. And if you go to the blog, Think Christian Theism, which is not my blog, but I do contribute sometimes, I have several posts on there. So that's what I would throw out. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on here, Eddie.
Yeah,
It was
absolutely,
great.
man.
I had to follow Michael Jones, which is not an easy task, but, but I hope it was
and, yeah, and the Exodus.
yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it's man, I thank you so much for your time. The presentation was fantastic. And maybe when you get further into the book or other things that you come up with, I'd love
Yeah,
to have you back on
definitely.
sometime. So everybody that joined us, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up, the subscribe, and the share. Um, Go to the places that Caleb told you. Look out for his book. I think he's going to give them away for like 99 cents to begin. No.
No, that'd be a good research, a good selling strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you everybody for joining us. Also, again, for those that may not have been here for the beginning, check out the description for the links to the content creator fund. We have we have quite a few people lined up, and funds are extremely low. Thank you. Love you guys. See you next time.